what I find interesting about this as we preface this conversation is just this idea of like, a lot of people don't know, and I recall a conversation I had with Daniel Sheehan, where I asked him, because I had heard murmurs of like, he talks a lot about how the indigenous cultures, because he works a lot with indigenous cultures.
Sheehan's a well-known
lawyer, well-known
Watergate lawyer.
Yeah, Watergate lawyer.
Pentagon
and so forth.
Papers, yeah.
Yeah. So he works a lot with indigenous, and I asked him outright, I was just like, how entrenched is extraterrestrial knowledge, extraterrestrial wisdom, and so forth? And by this, it isn't to say that it's like, oh, this advanced knowledge and so forth. It's different, right? Yeah. How entrenched is that within a lot of indigenous cultures, including the Lakota, who he works a lot with? And he said, it's well known that that's where a lot of their beliefs, teachings, and so forth come from. Like the Lakota and extraterrestrials, like specifically to a specific sort of people that they talk about. I mean, it's very, very, very common. They don't come out and say, oh, extraterrestrials and aliens and in the teachings, but all the elders, like that's what it is. That's what they're referring to, right?
Right, and it's not just in Lakota, it's all over North America, even here in Canada. The unfortunate thing is, when colonization happened, a lot of these stories were lost, and a lot of religious indoctrination happened, and a lot of communities have no idea about this stuff.
And this is one of those interesting, realities again, where you look at what history could say, you look at what modern culture could be, right? Had you not had a reshaping, right? All these things where we walk around and it's like, oh, it's funny to think about extraterrestrials. Like, that's silly. Like all these things that go on, it's like you're on the fringe. It's like, well, all it would have taken was a lack of manipulation of ancient knowledge, and extraterrestrials would be common knowledge today. It would be a common conversation. There would be no working through the fringe.
I heard the ones that actually lived here and amongst the people, indigenous people, actually left when colonization happened, which is interesting.
Well, there's even talk about the Mayans having left.
I heard that a lot of them, the Mayans, actually left the planet. I heard a lot of indigenous populations at the time of colonizations from this book left with their ET family, and some chose to stay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's how even the Mayans, when you look at the Mayans and you have, how are we talking about aliens? We're talking about underground bases. I mean, there's a connection, but
we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
Connect the dots.
It's just it's just kind of, these conversations happen organically. Sometimes you just got to go with it. But it's interesting because, the Mayans had this advanced civilization, if you will, from what we understand it as. Now, what does that mean? What does that look like? Does it mean high-rise buildings with cars that look a certain way? Does it mean, this idea of advanced civilization can mean different things, and having knowledge that perceivably you may or may not have, given the technological era in which you're existing in, doesn't necessarily say whether you're advanced or not advanced or this, that. That's a subjective idea that within each context of explanation requires, hey, what are we saying when we say advanced technology in this particular situation or that particular situation? But when we look at the Mayans, there's something there that is clearly they had knowledge of something. And a lot of what's coming out, and when you look in the indigenous stuff, is that they were this advanced group of beings that, left and potentially took, various forms of beings, humans here on Earth with them. And when we're talking about underground bases, what's interesting is these underground structures, right? You talk about how I have contact with somebody, and I was asked sort of not to name names, so I won't even name the person I know that knows the people. But there's these people in Mexico where you can contact them, right? We've been offered this to go and do this, right? They will take you underground, and they will show you areas. I'm not talking about where you're going to see this massive city and it's whatever. That allegedly exists, right? You've heard a number of people talk about that. I've not spoken directly to anybody who went down and did it. I mean, you can look at the testimony of Corey Good and say, is he telling the truth with that? Is his experience legit? And that's up for you to decide, right? For you to decide what's going on there.
Admiral Byrd,
right? There's a lot of different things, right? But in terms of people who've taken the walk and who've done it, actual taken the walk, not just hey, I went down in a ship or a sphere or so forth, which again is coming out, that information is coming out. But people who've actually taken the walk, these people in Mexico that can take you down and go and do this, they said, you have to go armed, right? Because there's beings and creatures down there that are not. It's not like they're like, oh, I want to kill you. Is it? They're like animals. They're like one thing that was described to me was it's almost like this like dinosaurish predator-like animal that it eats humans because it's quite large, right? So it's like people who go down there, people who make that journey, who make that trek, it's like, yeah, it's known you got to go armed and be ready to go because it's like, would you walk into an alligator swamp with no sort of protection? And you know what I'm saying? Like these animals have the ability to kill you. So it's like that as you go underground. And they say that you can get down into certain areas where like the caverns are quite large and there are beings living there, but it's not necessarily, in this particular case, it's not necessarily the sort of advanced flowing river, beautiful this, beautiful that, but they say that there's light down there that seems to come from almost like an alive, like almost like when you walk into a cave and you see those glow worms, I think they call them. It's like that, but they say there is light down there, right? And you've heard testimony from other people, and even those people talk about, there's more advanced areas, we don't know where they are, right? Because obviously the Earth is huge, and obviously the idea of having an inner Earth or an underground potential societies, like you got to think, like when you think of the size of the Earth, you don't need the whole Earth to be hollow. You need pockets to be cavernous, right? And potentially largely cavernous, and you could do so much, right, in those areas,
it's huge
right?
In there. Earth is huge. Yeah.
So I was playing a video game one time and I at this point, Shambhala, right, was an idea I had heard of before, right? And you just talked about, in this book, you just talked about blue people that would come up.
Yeah.
And this idea of blue people is rife throughout ancient knowledge and ancient history and so forth, where they would discuss how there were these pale blue-skinned people that did live below the earth. And it was funny because I was playing this video game. It was one of the Uncharted games. This was way back in the day. And it's Journey to Shambhala or something it's called. And as you're going and going and going, you kind of enter into this space where you start to go underground. But you're not going underground quite yet. You're going in this like mountain range, and you're kind of like getting deeper and deeper, and eventually you sort of go and you come to this tree, which is like the tree of life, right? And the magical water, if you drink from the water or something like that, you have eternal life, all these different things. And as you go and going, and then eventually you kind of get to this point where you're at this entrance now to underground. And you go, and then the game loads, and you open up into this underground world that's like beautiful, like the flowing rivers, the beautiful, everything, like just masterfully amazing. And as you go through it, all of a sudden these blue people start coming after you. And they're like big, whatever. That could be the depiction that the game made. And of course, this entire story is from a video game. But the idea was just this, I was completely taken aback. I'm like, I've heard this story so many times. I had been researching this stuff of going underground and these blue people and these different things that are happening. And all of a sudden I'm playing this game and it's all happening. And I'm like, I wonder if this is kind of what it was like. And so
even in India, there blue people, there are stories of them, the gods, that they lived underground.
Exactly. And it's the idea of why do we assume that the gods of previous times, the gods in ancient Greece and so forth, why do we assume that those are mythical figures and that those are characters? Again, which aspect of that, right? When you look at the stranglehold that religion has had, and again, here's when you go back to Danny Sheehan again, the lawyer that I was talking to, I mean, he has, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but there's connections within his group where they have access to the Vatican secret vaults, right? And so people have gotten in and seen certain information that's there. And what's held at the Vatican in terms of information and in terms of like true history of what's going on on Earth and what has happened, it's a completely different story. Even in the mainstream, people are debunking our ideas of ancient Egypt, which is challenging our entire story of what's actually going on.
Well, they went around trying to conquer the world, and they grabbed up all the knowledge and hid it and kept it for themselves, kind of maybe so they can make up their own story. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and that's the challenge, right? Is we're getting a lot of our information from what was really a very religious power hold over countries that became very prominently powerful in popular culture and so forth. Like when we look at the West, for example, right? There's a lot of narratives that go on around the world on a larger scale. I'm not talking about localized stories that are told and different things that happen in other areas of the world that you do have a very different perspective. But when we're talking about the West and its West's influence over other countries, there's a popular story which really comes from whatever could fit into the religious story, right? The Catholic story. What's going to support the Bible? What's going to support that? And it makes you question, what the heck do we really know? People ask the question, well, how does history get manipulated? Well, that's how history gets manipulated, right? That's how it happens. That's how we don't know about these things that become myth or that become legend, but that legitimately are real.